Is July 2nd, 2021. Welcome to Native Calgarian. Oki, Naganago, Mekoche, J. Stokom Aki. My name is Red Thunder Woman. My English name is Michelle Robinson, and I use she and her pronouns. Native Calgarian is being recorded on the lands of the Niitsitapi, which is the Blackfoot Confederacy. The Blackfoot south of the imposed US border are the Blackfeet, and north of the border are the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani of the Confederacy. These lands are Treaty 7, signed September 22nd, 1877, with signatures that include the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Wesley, Chiniki, Bearspaw Nations of the Stoney, and the Dene from Tsuut'ina. I acknowledge all First Nation, Métis, Inuit, status and non-status across Turtle Island as the keepers of these lands. All non-Indigenous are treaty partners with the government signing on their behalf. I honor the Blackfoot, and boy, especially after yesterday, the Blackfoot have been so gracious to me. Elder Red Crane taught me how to pronounce my spirit name. I was born here in Calgary, or Blackfoot Mokinstis, and was given the name Michelle Elliott, an English name which has afforded me privilege in an English colonial world. My mother is Northern Slavey Dene, or Satu Dene, but my Indian Act Imposed status card by the Canadian government says Yellow Knives Dene. My father is so Canadian. I'm a daughter of the Mayflower, a daughter of the American Revolution, while having an Indian Act Imposed status card. My Dene lineage roots me in the land of the Hare people, also called the Great Bear Lake people, in Treaty 11. I'm a native to Turtle Island, and my Dene nation is a visitor to this area of Plincho Tine Indahe in Satu Dene, meaning Many Horse Town, named after the Calgary Stampede. Land acknowledgements are critical for creating a safer space for Indigenous, as well as honoring the host as the guest and acknowledging my role and your role as a treaty partner. My humblest apologies to Blackfoot elders and language keepers as I try to learn proper pronunciation. Any mistakes or misinterpretations will be on me. I encourage questions so that misunderstandings can be cleared up as soon as possible. I don't speak on behalf of all Indigenous, but I share what I know as I walk down my red road. My Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you to my previous donors for showing your support. If you value listening or watching and can afford to give, thank you. For those that cannot afford to give, I'd love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com. Send in your comments or your questions. I also have a YouTube channel that you can go and subscribe. Go to nativecalgarian.com for the latest podcasts and pin posts on social media. So today's kind of a special day for me because I get to have a friend on. And Esmahan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks so much, Michelle. Thanks for having me, first of all, and thank you for that land acknowledgement. It was really beautiful. So my name is Esmahan. I've been a friend of Michelle's, I think, since 2015. So that's almost 6 years, which is a long time. And I'm really happy to be on the show. Michelle and I talked about how I should introduce myself before this. And I think what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about my heritage, which is not something that I do in a really explicit way. But I immigrated to Canada when I was 13 years old. I'm half Arab and half Turkish. But within that, there is a lot of like mixedness happening. My father's side is Arab, but he comes from a line of people who actually moved quite a bit across Asia because of different kind of persecution reasons. And my great grandmother actually has a really interesting story. She is Iraqi, or was Iraqi, I should say, was the sole inheritor at a very young age of a decent amount of wealth, but then was married off at 13 to a much older man so that she wouldn't inherit that money. Anyway, long story short, that's kind of my dad's side, quite complicated. My mother's side, like I said, she's Turkish. And I guess the reason I'm thinking about this and talking about this is because I was telling Michelle earlier, when you first immigrate here, or at least when I first immigrated here, I was immigrating from a place that had quite a restrictive, was very, I should say, restrictive on women, lots of, human rights issues. And so when I came here, there was a lot of gratefulness associated with, being Canadian. I actually became Canadian at 18 and swore an oath. and which was to the Queen, which was like quite interesting. And you know, quite the experience. It's like this big formal thing that you celebrate. And it wasn't, I should say, until you know, maybe the last decade that I started realizing more slowly what it meant to be a settler and a non-Indigenous person, and how, you know, I had to like, while I'm like very grateful to be here, and I'm very grateful for the opportunities that were afforded to me here, I can't separate that from the fact that, you know, there is a history in this country of oppression of Indigenous people and the original peoples of this land. And my being here is also a perpetuation of that treatment. And so that's something that's like really, I think, I know, Michelle, we're going to talk about this a little bit, but I know that there are a lot of people in newcomer communities who, you know, we don't get the opportunities to learn this, and we learn it later on. And it's one of those things that you're like, wow, like, but I was so grateful because I'm coming from such rough circumstances. And what does that mean? Like, and, you know, I know there are a lot of discussions about, well, am I a part of it? Am I a part of this, or do I have to own this when, you know, maybe it happened in the past? But like, as the very upsetting news over the last few weeks, you know, learning about these the bodies of Indigenous children being found all over the country, I mean, that's not history, that's now. So we don't get to say that. So anyway, that's my introduction.
Yeah, and you know, so I'm just going to be, you know, so I loved what you just said, because it's really starting to recognize a dynamic that's not there. And you know, just to kind of bring it to other folks, like as a person who was, you know, born and raised here, and in this, like, you know, settler social media, settler education, you know, I mean, we're all raised to be like that, to ignore Indigenous issues and to be proud Canadians. So much so that, you know, so I'm 44. And when I was 18 was when Molson Canadian had this like huge campaign about I am Canadian. And like I have my first tattoo was a maple leaf, because I thought there's no way I could possibly regret putting a maple leaf on my body. There's no way.
Oh, wow.
Yep. So, but my family, my father's settler side, like they are very anti-tattoo. So, like they made fun of me. Actually, even my grandma, she was like, "Oh, so are you a biker now? Are you hanging out with like Hell's Angels?" I'm like, "What?" So I got like literally the tattoo that you have put a uniform on. You know, my dad, my grandpa, that he put a uniform on. Your family put like put uniforms on for, and I'm a biker for getting a tattoo, right? So it really was shocking to me how stigmatized tattoos were. But then as I started to learn more about Indigenous issues, and I understood that tattoos used to be like a way of like our journey on this road, like we would all tattoo ourselves, I started to see that there was correlation there too, to like the Christian belief system of you never tattoo your sacred temple to, you know, and that imposed doctrine on our people to Indigenous ways and eradicating that, right? So there was that. So I just wanted to give you that perspective too, because like as somebody who was born and raised here and given this propaganda, I mean, if you're not a proud Canadian by the time you're 18 or 19, then obviously the education and the mass media campaigns failed you somewhere. So, you know, just to give that perspective, and the other part of, you know, having Esmahan on here was the impetus of this was actually her calling me to check on me, to say, hey, how's it going? And the irony being, at that point in time, there was like what, the fourth attack in Edmonton on somebody who was, I think she was wearing a hijab, like noticeably Muslim, and there's so much Islamophobia happening right now. I mean, everywhere, but definitely here in Alberta. That I was like, well, you know, you're calling to check on me when vice versa is true, that I should be calling to check on you and seeing how you're doing as well. And so I thought it was so important to have you on to talk about not just what it's like for you to see these, these concepts that you're trying to awake to, but also folks like in my community. I have met some really like anti-Muslim, anti-Islamophobic folks out there that I'm like, hold up, folks, like the Arnold Schwarzenegger movies and all of the other propaganda that we've been taught about Islam, like it's really done a good job on you, you know. So, and I'm lucky enough to know you and a few other folks in the Muslim community to not obviously harbor that. But I mean, I've gone out of my way to do that, and a lot of regular Joe Canadians are not going out of their way to meet the Muslim community, but also not going out of their way to learn about Indigenous issues. So like, there's so many intersectionalities here as well, and it's complicated with the Indian residential schools and the proud Canadian, concepts that you were referring to as well. Like there's so much to unpack. And that's why I'm so glad that you could be on my show to talk about all of this. And, I don't want to normalize what you said, but I hope that you see that unfortunately it is normalized to ignore Indigenous people and to be proud Canadians. Like that's our propaganda.
Well, there's so much that you said there, Michelle, that I hope that I like remember everything and can like refer to it, because there's so many interesting things that I think we can talk about. But I mean, yeah, like the context of our conversation kind of started in this, like both of our communities are experiencing violence in different ways. And I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who you actually know, who's a member of the Jewish community. And this was about a month ago. And we were just talking about how, within our communities, all of our communities experience so much violence and hatred. And yet all of our communities also have racism and hatred inside them as well. And it's, it's so sad, because I feel like ultimately we are all kind of affected negatively by the same systems. And when one of us is impacted in one way, we might not see it, but it actually impacts other marginalized groups as well, because it makes it okay for that to happen. And I don't know how much you're following the stuff on like critical race theory that's happening in the US, and obviously the discussions that we're having now about the curriculum here, and like actually trying to create like an anti-racist curriculum so that children can learn about this. Because when I was in school, I mean, I did a couple of years of elementary school in Canada, but then I lived abroad and then came back. And so I like, the only thing that I remember learning about Indigenous peoples was like in the context of quote unquote the discovery of Canada, as though there was nobody here before, but then yes, there were here. And then they were very like, it's just this like really weird kind of 2 chapters in your history textbook. And there's like this maybe like one section on Indigenous peoples, and then an odd mention here or there about like fur trades. And then you talk about like Louis Riel and stuff, and maybe, and that's kind of like when it ends almost, like
Yeah.
And I grew up in Toronto, and I actually, and this is like shocking to me now, but did not have a single Indigenous classmate, did not have a single Indigenous teacher, did not have like an Indigenous like unit or like or anything like that in school at all. And then on the flip side of that, I also moved here and immigrated like right when 9/11 happened. And I remember like going to school and being like, oh my God, like what are people going to think? And then seeing like this normalization of Islamophobia, where all of a sudden like every evil character in every movie was a Muslim, and like you just had to be so careful what you talked about. I mean, I was very anti-Iraq war, and I remember like it was one of those things where I mean, it was better in Canada to some degree, but like you had to be so careful how you talked about it, because people thought you were like sympathizing with terrorists or something like. And I don't know if you remember, but we went through this really long period where every Muslim had to like apologize every time there was like a terrorism attack, even though many of us fled countries because of, you know, really terrible things like that. So it didn't even make sense, but we were still expected to do it. So it's just looking back on those times and thinking about what was okay and how we normalized the absence of Indigenous people, how we normalized Islamophobia, you know, like all of those things are tied together. Um, and we're seeing their effects now.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. I'm man, 9/11. You know, and the irony is up to a 9/11, there was still so much anti-Muslim propaganda, like so much of it. And when 9/11 happened, like I was drafting downtown and I had a Muslim friend or a coworker, colleague, I should say, and we had kids about the same time. So we've really drifted apart. But I remember trying to ask her about like, you know, like what's going on with this, and expecting her to, you know, give me world politics 101. And the irony, of course, today I'm like, you want me to answer that, then you pay me. You know, about Indigenous issues. So it's kind of funny, that because I know I remember having that conversation and feeling like, how do I even talk to her about this? Like, what's going on? How do we engage and make sure and fix this? But I was having a political conversation at work, which is also inappropriate, I think. So, in the context of what it was, anyway, it's so easy to go off here. With the attacks that are happening right now, against the Muslim community. How do you identify as Muslim?
I do, yeah, I do identify as Muslim, and I mean, I'm not a super observant Muslim, and I have the privilege also of not being a visible Muslim. Like, I don't cover my hair. You know, I wear, you know, sleeveless dresses and like short dresses and things like that. So, but my name, I think, is the big tell for me. And then, you know, my skin color is like darker, I guess. Although I would still say like there are, you know, Black Muslims, and I don't have to deal with the sort of the colorism and stuff that exists within the community and outside as well. So I'm definitely like coming at this from a very privileged space. But even so, I mean, you know, I mean, I've talked to you about this, Michelle. We both talked about our experiences, both as, you know, candidates and just existing in this world and the kinds of things that we've had to deal with. I don't know if you remember this, but like a few years ago, there were all these news stories about like white supremacist groups in Alberta, like the 3%ers and the Canadian infidels and all these things. And I remember people talking about it in a very like abstract way, but it was scary. And I went to Stampede and was leaving and saw a group of men wearing shirts from one of those groups, and literally feeling terror, right? And but also privilege, because I knew that, like, you know, they might see me and be like, oh well, we can't really tell with her. But if you know, I have friends who wear the hijab, or my brother who is quite darker than me, or my dad who is like much darker than me, like I was just thinking, like, what happens if they run into these people, right? And you know, my dad and brother have both been called sand N-word in school and at work. Again, but both you and I have you know, had very racist things said to our faces in like things that I don't know why it still shocks me every time it happens, but it does. And maybe that's naive of me still, but it's just getting worse out there. And I think, and I'm really curious to hear about this from an Indigenous perspective as well, but I just feel like racism has become, it used to be one of those things that people kind of talked about maybe within their homes and were a bit more ashamed about, or it maybe was like less socially acceptable. But with like the Donald Trumps of the world and these, you know, far right accounts and leaders being okay saying these things out loud, it's just become so much more in your face. And it really feels to me like we're almost at a boiling point, you know, especially with like the Muslim woman violence in Edmonton, I honestly am feeling like somebody is going to die. And I hate that I'm saying that out loud, but it just feels like it's building up to that point. I'm curious to know what you think.
Yeah. Oh, this is a harder conversation because it's admitting what Canadians are actually like. Um, Being born here, so I've been in Calgary, in Fort McMurray, Sylvan Lake, back in Calgary, and now we're venturing to Lethbridge, and that's the first time I've publicly said that, by the way. Um, yeah. So and honestly, I actually believe that there's like different levels of racism, and the level of racism that you're talking about is that, like, top part where we both know, like, murder is around the corner for the Muslim community. And because and just to give perspective to folks who might not know, here in Calgary, there was I can't stand the UCP, so I can't even say it without wanting to spit. But one of their stupid elected idiots, their daughter was actually attacked, and I don't condone that in any way. But I did call it out because these are the folks. Like, I don't know why she would have run for the UCP to begin with, because they've shown nothing federally and provincially other than yeah, Islamophobic rhetoric for years. So I don't know why she would even run with them, but she did, and now her kid's getting attacked. And her kid, when I say that, was an adult, and still attacked in Calgary. And I just called it out because it's like, you are literally in a position of power. You folks are purposely not giving us proper Indigenous curriculum. You're purposely not giving us anti-racism education. You're literally in the position of power to change it. And now when your kid gets attacked, is this finally a conversation that blue side can finally have? But I know that's not the case, because Jason Kenney was just out condemning church burning rather than condemning the dead bodies that came from his Catholic faith. So it's really hard to talk about that. Now I know I'm so angry because I'm thinking of the UCP. I've totally forgot what the question was. I'm sorry, Esmahan. But that bigger picture is that, like, my people have been openly targeted and murdered since as long as I can remember. So and the anti-Indigenous education society in general is so rampant that that's what gives people permission to kill. So, like, we're having Métis men being killed by the RCMP up north. Calgary police killed some Indigenous women in Calgary, right where I live. There's a lot of suspect when it comes to Colton Crowshoe and police. Some white guy out in Siksika, or out in Gleason, or Strathmore, followed a Siksika member home and killed him.
My
Like,
God.
this is my normal. So when we talk about level of violence to kill Muslims, like, yeah, we're getting there for sure. But that bigger picture also is that, welcome to my world. I'm not safe anywhere in Canada. We've talked about, like, where is the safe place for Indigenous people to go, right? But I don't know what that answer is, so we haven't left. Let's put it that way. But that bigger picture is that it's not okay that I'm in this situation. It's not okay your community is being put in this situation at all. And the sad part is I think it's always been normalized in Canada to kill people you hate. The problem is that, like, we don't see it. So, like, I've had a friend that has been on twice now, and she has a book, Natalie, and she's from Germany, and she talked about how after Hitler, like, all of their schooling, everything that they have has, like, almost anti-nationalism sentiment to it. Whereas with Canada, it's the opposite. It's like, I am Canadian is such a proud thing. You'll hear people talk about how proud they are to go traveling with, like, a Canadian flag on their patch on their backpack or something, right? Like, that's so normalized here. So and the irony being is that we shouldn't. we shouldn't be normalizing it, and that is literally what's causing the problems that we have. But folks like Kenny, I know he knows, and that's why he's like, I'm a proud Canadian, I'm a proud Catholic, masks off on July 1st. Like I know he knows, and that's why he's doing it, so that he can maintain that fascism that he loves. Like Bill 1, let's go after the natives right away federally. No one's voting for UNDRIP, like that. Just a matter of time until it's your community too. Like that saying that it's like, nobody stood for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, like that's totally Indigenous experience. And then watching, the Muslim community or other communities get targeted that way, it's like, oh, this is where we're at. Like, because we are undergoing genocide, and Canada just doesn't want to admit that truth. So yeah, it's hard because I don't like what's happening to your community at all. And the idea of like you or some of our other mutual friends, like I can't even think about it. The idea that you guys get to experience the level of violence Indigenous people do, I hate it. I hate it so much. So
Well, it's terrible. And I think to your point, I mean, um, if you make it okay to treat one group of people like that, then you can treat any group of people like that, right? And I mean, um, speaking from like a Muslim context, I think one of the first killings that was based on Islamophobia after 9/11 actually targeted a Sikh man, because there is a lot of ignorance about, I feel like those of us who are, on the spectrum of brown skinned are like all the same. I can't tell you how many times people are like conflate like Arabs and Latin people and Iranians, and it's just like a lot of Indians and Pakistanis. Like we're all in the same group, but more broadly, all of us who are non-white are in a group together, where at various times, like, I mean, in an Indigenous case, in a more constant systemic way, I mean, there is this like violence, right? So that's why I truly believe that, what we see is that nobody is immune to this. You can be the daughter of a minister and still be targeted, which is so disgusting and so unfortunate. But it literally, when people have this kind of hate in their heart, they don't distinguish. They don't say like, oh, this person is like on our side, or this person is not on our side, whatever our side is. And so truly, for us to get rid of this violence, like everybody needs to be involved. And because we're all unsafe, right? Like we are all unsafe. And that means, really addressing Indigenous violence at the center. I think that needs to be center to all of our discussions, because the fact that it is so normalized and is, I mean, a lot of us are, I will say, like, I feel like a lot of people are learning now about the violence that Indigenous people face. But you said earlier, so much of it is unsaid, and so much of it is unsaid. I remember having a discussion with a woman who is Indigenous at the Women's March once, and she was, telling me that one of the reasons that she was there marching is because she had been sexually assaulted, and when she went to the police, they were like, oh, well, like, they were basically implying that because she's Indigenous, she was asking for it, right? And how many stories exist like that? I mean, there must be so many that we don't know of. And that's, I think, the really dangerous thing. Like, we allow things to get to a boiling point because we dismiss so much. And because so many people feel unsafe reporting stories. I mean, when my dad was called the sand N-word at work, he phoned the police, and they were just kind of like, okay, well, thanks for telling us. There's nothing we can do, which fair enough in some respects. But on the other hand, like, I couldn't help but think, if that person is that angry that they're okay saying that to somebody in their workplace, what's going to set them off next time? Is it going to be violent? I mean, it's really, I feel like sometimes the onus is put on those of us who hear things like that to kind of be in charge of our own safety and just hear these things and hope that you're not in a situation that's going to escalate to violence. But like I don't even know if people realize that sits on you. That's like, it's a burden that you carry, where you're like, how bad is this interaction going to get? How much do I have to deal with? Like, and we talk about this in a gender context a lot, where, a lot of times women, when we're in these situations, we're encouraged to like, or we're socialized to just kind of like smile and laugh it away to put ourselves in a safe situation. But I mean, these are all burdens that we carry. And then depending on your intersecting identities, some people carry those burdens in a way that is like unimaginable. Like if you're an Indigenous woman and that so many of your sisters have gone missing and have been brutalized, I mean, that's a scary world to walk into. So
No, it is. It's upsetting. I yeah, that's tough, man. I don't know what to say about that kind of stuff. It's hard to encapsulate how violent this world is against us. Like, we can't go to a doctor, we can't go to a nurse, we can't go to a social worker, we can't go to a teacher, we can't go to the police. It's really that simple. Like, there's not a single public servant that is an Indigenous person we can go to. And then to hear your dad try, and you know, if as a man he can't get help, women are totally screwed. And then, there's I was recently invited to a stupid outreach for the hate bill that they're putting forward. And it's just so out of touch and out of reality. And everybody there that was at that, like the government officials, they were all white, all of them. Yeah. And I was invited, so I went and I listened to it, and like the type of questions that you can ask, and it's the whole thing is framed wrong, the whole thing. And then the way the outreach is set up is that you have to ask very specific questions to the bill, or how it was designed, and they're really not in a position to change it. They're just talking to us and telling us this is what's happening. And one of the Asians from our community here in Calgary, who was an elected official, she was like the only person who could kind of ask a question that was kind of relevant. And I'm like, as an Indigenous person, this is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. This is obviously not meant for anybody. I honestly think it's one of the worst things to watch. Is like, we're finally in a position of power to undo what Stephen Harper did, and we're really not fixing it. And it is what it is. This is just colonial politics 101. And it's designed to exclude POC. It's designed to exclude brown people, Indigenous people, every Black people. It's just designed that way. It's like literally a hate bill. And I'm just like, who is this for? This is literally a piece of paper to make liberals feel better that they tried to undo something Harper did. And I know whoever the next conservative leader is will undo it anyway. So it's just like the most stupid, pointless, performative politics that you can possibly witness. And then I think of real instances like what your dad went through, what we go through every single day as Indigenous people in this country. And we're not even kind of close to wanting to address any of it at all. And
no.
yeah, that TRC, we were talking a bit about, you were talking actually about critical race theory, and I was talking about anti-racism training and how that would like help everybody. And that's TRC, called Action 57, is education, anti-racism training and Indigenous education for all public servants. And like, I'm a believer, if we did institute real critical race theory and anti-patriotism, that we would actually really create a stronger nation. But like, you see the rhetoric today by the stupid blue side, both federally and provincially, like, oh, Justin Trudeau hates Canada. I'm like, he is Captain Canada. Like, he's so Canadian. I can't even like, literally, I can't even believe it. But the propaganda is so strong. I like, as somebody I absolutely love, I tried to say Pierre Elliott Trudeau created the Indian residential school system. And I'm like, what kind of rebel media crap do you listen to that you believe that they feel confident saying it and that you feel confident enough to believe it to perpetuate it? Like, I honestly feel like the people are so stupid right now. The only thing they know how to do is hate and hurt. And I just don't know how, like, when you asked the question earlier about, do you think it's getting worse? It's like, it's so funny because social media is just a tool. Social media is a tool for me to speak. This podcast is like an outcome of that. And yet you have these, incredible organizations, like you were talking about the hate organizations, and that's kind of that propaganda machine that's out there. I mean, so many people use that tool for negative, for bad. And it's just like, okay, like, and then they have the audacity to say that anyone who doesn't agree with it is anti-Canadian. So like, I'm trying to understand how, media has been such a misused tool that here we are. The people are questioning whether the earth is round, whether there was dinosaurs, and whether racism is a thing. Like, it's incredible to me. We literally have the Indian Act embedded in the Canadian Constitution, and people still are like, I don't think there's racism in Canada. So I don't even know how you take the average person who thinks these thoughts and like deprogram them into good citizens.
I mean, I remember seeing a federal political leader, I think it was Aaron O'Toole, say that systemic racism doesn't exist a few months ago when we were having this sort of discussions around Black Lives Matter. And I mean, to your point, I mean, the Indian Act exists, and I mean, they're just the children in care. I mean, that's like one of the biggest examples of systemic racism, right? Like, how do you, and you said earlier, and I think that that's something that people should really think about, like, because a lot of our communities don't have the same experience, where a social worker, a teacher, like, in many ways, those professions were weaponized against Indigenous people to like rip families apart, right? And that's a really difficult legacy. That it's not even a legacy because it's kind of ongoing, like, that we all have to recognize and move towards. And I think you're right. Like, I mean, implementing the TRC calls to action, like, I think we've only fully implemented 12. I think 12 is a number, like, partially implemented, like around 60, and I think 20 plus we haven't even touched. And I mean, what is that, like over half a decade now that those calls to action have been out. And I do worry too that, like, our communities go through this trauma of like being in the news because of terrible things, but then the minute we're not the headline, people forget and don't push for action. And I really hope that that's not the case, particularly in response to the bodies that have been found. Like, I hope that we really push for the calls to action to be implemented. But I will say, like, I lived in Vancouver for almost a year and a half, and moved back to Calgary last November. And it was really interesting because there was a discussion around like the Coastal Gas pipeline issue. And there was a split within the Indigenous community about whether the pipeline would be a good thing, right? Like, there were different perspectives, and that's normal. Like, no community is a monolith. Everybody thinks like, oh, all Muslims think this, or all women think this. That's never the case. But what I thought was really disturbing was the way that those perspectives were being like exploited by both sides of the issue, who were like, well, let's support this Indigenous side, and let's support this Indigenous side. And I'm like, maybe step back and allow Indigenous people to have a conversation internally about this, right? Like, why? I don't know, we're just at a really uncomfortable space. I think I am hopeful that I think that people, there is a desire to do better, but I don't know if that desire to do better will persist when people realize that it's going to make them uncomfortable and cause them to think about things in a way that maybe they've never thought of before. And none of us like change, and none of us like to be made uncomfortable. But if we don't allow that to happen, then we're just kind of like papering over things. I mean, you talked about this hate bill that you were invited to a consultation for. I saw some news earlier about money being given to places of worship to help beef up security, which it's good, and it's good. I'm glad that's happening. But at the same time, so many attacks against Muslims, for example, are happening outside of faith-based places. Like they're happening on the street. The murders, I should say, in London happened on the street. Like it's literally not safe in some places to be a Muslim out there walking. It's not safe to be, you can speak more about the Indigenous perspective, and you said so eloquently, like, is there a place that Indigenous people can feel safe? Is there a place that Black men feel safe? Is there a place that Black women feel safe? Like, those are real questions. And this kind of like piecemeal, like, let's give some funding here and make this place a little bit better. But that's not the issue. The issue is the perspectives that exist in our society that allow people to go and be violent based on racism, right? And I always feel like the onus is on marginalized groups and racialized groups to like protect us and to solve racism and to solve, to solve reconciliation and make everything great. But it's like, it's not really our responsibility here.
Well, it's the concept of systemic racism means systemic changes by the people who benefit. And that's the problem. Like, so for example, that conversation that you were talking about when it comes to the split in the pipelines, what I love the fact that everybody wants to exploit that conversation rather than the systemic racism that causes that. And the systemic racism is that because there's not dollar to dollar funding for Indigenous people compared to non-Indigenous, then of course we are underserved and we are in poverty. So we have systemic racism, imposed poverty, and nobody wants to address that part, which might be why somebody would want a pipeline if that means that they could put food on the table for 5 minutes. Because systemic poverty that's been imposed by Canada from the Indian Act has never allowed wealth. And that is the problem. I mean, that's the problem we should be talking about, not whether or not we should build a damn pipeline. But I know what you mean about it being exploited on both sides, because I'm like one of the people that hates the environment movement the most because they silence Indigenous voices. And the irony being, if they legitimately cared about environmentalism, they would center Indigenous voices, because we've been maintaining this place. Literally was the Garden of Eden that the Christians talk about, and then they came here and wrecked it. Like literally came here and wrecked it. And then because of capitalism and greed. And that's the irony, is that their religion and their so-called belief systems is like, anti-greed and anti-sin. And it's like, but every single awful sin that you could possibly imagine was actually done to Indigenous people in order for them to create the system that they could exploit to ruin the Garden of Eden. Right? Like, it's so incredible. And then, again, address the systemic racism that would address this issue of the pipeline. But we're talking about people who are still fighting us on DRIP, let alone giving us rights for anything else. And the irony is, we've always come to the table with solutions. The treaty was made with the idea of equality. And because settlers have always been selfish and sinful, they take all of the money and all of the wealth and, ruin the land. So like, even their environmentalism is selfish and centered on them and not focused on Indigenous people who actually know the land and how to fix the land. So there's so many levels of, we are in such a messed up conversation that we can't even trust the so-called, progressives or the leftists or whatever. Vegans, they basically have ruined life for Inuit with their anti-meat campaign, rather than recognizing, an entire way of life for people who live and eat with seals. they exploited that conversation and became anti-Indigenous. Yeah, so there's so many levels of how messed up all of this is. Once again, all centered on systemic racism that nobody wants to talk about.
For sure. And I mean, your broader point too about um, people don't realize what the cost of food is like up north, right? And so think it's okay to prevent hunting, um, which like actually feeds people who maybe can't afford $60 to buy chicken. Or I mean, people should really look up prices of food up north. Like they are wild, and not many people could afford that. So I mean, systemic racism is the issue. I think it is so embedded in our lives that even those of us who and there are ways that I benefit from systemic racism, and I will just acknowledge that. But there are ways that I don't benefit, or that I'm like harmed by it as well. And like we don't even know all the things, right? I mean, there's so many studies that are coming out now, and I actually haven't seen this in an Indigenous context, but I'd be curious if you know this, Michelle. But I know like there's so many studies about Black women's health, for example, and like the shorter lifespans and the death rate compared to white women in hospitals for pregnancies and stuff. And a lot of that people are realizing is like the stress of dealing with racism all your life shortens your lifespan and gives you diseases. It's literally, racism is literally a public health issue. Like literally, and I'm using the word literally correctly here. It shortens people's lifespans. It gives them diseases. It affects their quality of life in ways that we haven't even accounted for or understand. And until we solve it, we're going to be seeing these systemic inequities, and there are so many types of like solutions, quote unquote, to racism or to feminism, for example, that like it empowers a few people, and we're like, oh, for example, in the US, like Barack Obama is now president, and so like racism is solved. Or like here, we had the first Indigenous woman as like the Attorney General, or things like this, and it's like, well, now it's like all solved, right? Like we can see like there's some Indigenous people on boards, there's some Black people on boards, there's some Muslims and on boards, but like that's not it. That's not it. What about the members of those communities who are in the most vulnerable position, who are working those frontline jobs, or who are living in poverty? Like those are the real measures of whether or not we're addressing racism or gender inequities or anything like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is why we have so many similar political belief systems. It's yeah. Anyway, did you want to talk about running, by the way? What that was like for you? And I only ask because I want to see some progressive school trustees and counselors running for municipal politics in Alberta for the October election, but we're really sadly lacking on progressive school trustees, that's for sure.
And I really want people to get more involved in the school trustee space, because this curriculum thing has me really upset. I don't have children. I don't have children, but I have a lot of friends who have young children. And when they saw the curriculum, that was the first time that people I know were like, I don't know if I can live in this province and raise my children anymore.
Yep.
And I totally get it. Like it's, there's so many things that are upsetting about it. So we really need people on the school trustee boards who are strong proponents of public education and of, addressing like inequities within education. So I'm really, really hopeful about that. Michelle, do you regret running?
No, I don't regret it at all, because part of it is, how you come to the table with solutions and you just tell people like these are the solutions, and then they're like, oh my God, you should run. And then you run, and then it's like, see, Indigenous women aren't electable. Like that's the whole concept, is that just because you come to the table with solutions doesn't mean that's what people want. They really want the white cis man who kisses babies to be the elected leader for no reason out of anything other than default.
Yeah, I don't regret running either. People ask me that all the time, like, you lost and like, do you regret it? And it's like, well, you actually learn so much. And being someone who runs for office, it's a really eye-opening experience when it comes to community, because if you care about community, you get to have conversations with communities and you get to really do that grassroots work of like building building solutions that really have that community perspective. You probably know this, Michelle, but like I'm such a fan of like AOC, for example. And I saw this really cool thing she did the other day where she used her volunteers during the pandemic to tutor underprivileged kids so that they would go like do better in like reading and math and stuff at school. And I mean, that's what politics can be, right? Like it can be about like making your communities better, not just through your elected, not just through like voting on things, but through like really being there in your community and being there to support them. And I really felt like I got to do that while I ran. But I don't want to paint a rosy picture of it either. Like if you are a woman, if you are a person of color, you're going to get a lot of, and I wonder if it's even worse this time around because of just like the acceptableness of some of the things that can be said now. But people have to unfortunately deal with that. And do you remember when we were running, Michelle, and like this really stuck with me because there was that video of Nenshi at a mosque where he was talking about the racism he was experiencing, and then it went viral, and then everybody was like, oh my god, Nenshi's playing the race card. And I was just like, if people think that Nenshi, who is this like, at the time, two-term mayor, beloved by Calgarians, is playing the race card, what are they going to think if I talk about racism? They're definitely going to think I'm playing the race card. They're not going to think it's like real because people don't want to face up to that.
Yeah, no, that's like a daily like thing I get every single day. Like if I comment on like the national post or something, it's like, oh, look who's playing the race card, and it's like,
Really?
yeah, look who's an ignorant asshole. It doesn't deserve my time and space. Walk.
Playing the race card. That's such a like, it's such an offensive term in and of itself, right?
Well, it's an ignorant, it's like there's ignorant and then there's ignorant. Like literally he's, whoever wrote that is such an idiot that they actually, and I don't mean to be able-bodied in that. I just mean that like literally they are decidedly so ignorant, decidedly to not know about racism. And then to have the confidence just shows that ignorance again and that lack of understanding. And I deal with that all the time with people who are like, want to downplay what the Indian Act actually is as race-based legislation. And it's like, how do you like exist feeling confident and telling your friends and your family that like you are that ignorant that you're willing to say that's not racist? Like honestly, it's like saying the sky is green and then just being so angry about it not being green. And it's like, okay, well, like how do we even have this discussion? Like you can't. They're just committed to be ignorant. They're so committed to it, you can't even try. And it's like these are the people who are voting in our elected officials. So i I don't even know like how we're going to fix this when you have a population that's so like daft. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm like more optimistic. I think like I really think that like there are a lot of people who believe that this stuff is wrong, but I don't know if they, I don't know. I think part of it is a lack of like, part of it is a failure of like the systems that we have in place, right? Where because so much of our media is white, when we talk about race related issues, often, it's like white people having this conversation about people of color as though like we are like an intellectual topic of debate or something, which is like not okay. And we need to have like representation in those conversations. And I think that if we do have some of that representation, and then we'll have some of those like harder conversations that people can really listen to. Angela Starrett is a woman I follow out in I think she's in Vancouver, and like she as a CBC journalist, and it really challenges people to think in a very like uncomfortable way, but it's the kind of like discomfort that you have to sit with and think about, and really listen to those opinions. And like I just hope we see more and more of these voices platformed and given the opportunity to share their stories. Because I remember reading, and both you and I are political, Michelle, that like the way that people changed their minds about same-sex marriage in the US was by learning the stories. First of all, learning that so many people around them were members of the LGBTQ plus community, and seeing the impact on them. But for so many people, like I told you, my experience growing up in Toronto, literally never encountered an Indigenous person. Like that is, I wonder how many people like that exist, right? And didn't have the opportunity like I did then to, move around the country and like actually meet like real life Indigenous people and like hear their stories from their mouths. We need to hear those things, because I think once people understand what is going on and that this isn't just something that's in a textbook, then I really think that they will want to do more. But we have to build up to that, and we need leaders who have political courage. I mean, so much of it is that so many of the leaders we have just don't have that political courage. They're not willing to lose an election to do the right thing.
Yeah,
which is not okay.
Yeah, I know. And how Jody Wilson Rainbow made through that, I have no idea. I actually, I didn't have faith in people to vote her back in. And now that we're probably going into another fall election, will they vote her in again? Because I think nationally there's an appetite for her to be so strong, and especially during that SNL Lavalin thing. But that bigger picture that I just didn't have faith that people would vote her in. But then I knew an Indigenous guy who purposely moved into her riding so that he could vote for her.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah. And I was like, and it's beginning to be like that, where it's like if you have that option to be like, okay, who do I really love? And it's like I kept saying to my husband, can you get a job in Edmonton so we can move into Janice Irwin's like riding? That would be really great. Because I just needed somebody progressive in my life who representing me.
Yeah. Janice is awesome.
Yeah, I know, right? Wouldn't it be great to like if Amarjeet Sohi wins, to be like, remember when Rachel won, and then she was our mayor, she was our premier, Justin Trudeau was our prime minister, and it was like such a middle finger to the blue side. And if Amarjeet Sohi becomes mayor, it'll be like really close to that similar belief system if you lived in like a Janice Irwin type riding, I guess, constituency provincially. It would be so great to live in that again. So I don't know, but one has to dream.
Well, you know what? And who knows? I mean, like, first of all, I think Amarjeet's doing pretty well in his mayoral race in Edmonton. A little jealous of Edmontonians, because I think he's going to be such a great mayor if he's elected.
Yep.
Such a great guy.
Yep.
But, I mean, I do think that like, in the last election, the last provincial election, like I was helping the NDP. And I remember when there were all these things that were coming out about some of the candidates that were running for the UCP. It just didn't matter, right? Like these like all these like racist things were being said, and there were homophobic things, and it really didn't matter. And I hope it matters this time. Like I hope that, people recognize that those kinds of views, I mean, I truly believe that like ultimately, like the biggest quality I want in a politician is compassion. I want someone who cares about everybody, regardless of their educational background, skin color, profession. Like they should care about everybody. And like part of the reason that I think we did so poorly this pandemic was because, our government I don't think that we saw I would have liked to see more compassion from our government. I will say that, there were people who were frontline workers who were still having to work and don't have like access to like so many things that I think would have made their experiences more safe. Just so much. And I really hope that when we think about what we all went through this pandemic, and we think about what kind of governments we want, we think about elected officials who have the compassion to care about people's lives and center that.
Oh, you're speaking to my soul. I wish that was the thing. I think it's just really important that you kind of brought up the point that, we didn't see the compassion from our leaders that we needed. And of course, that contributed to vaccine hesitancy. I felt we were really lucky in the Indigenous community. Dr. James Makokis, who won the Amazing Race, and we have like Dr. Esther Tailfeathers, all these amazing doctors in Alberta who are Indigenous. They worked really hard nationally. There were other Indigenous doctors that worked really hard to make sure that we were first in line, because we're already undergoing a genocide. So, the last thing we need is like another disease to, disproportionately affect us. So we
Yeah.
were really lucky to have advocates like that from the beginning to really encourage Indigenous people to get their shots. I got my second shot immediately right away. I was like first in line at both shots. So I
Good.
did. Yeah. But my daughter, she still has to get her second one. Like, I signed myself up through an Indigenous program, and I didn't with my daughter. And I so regret it, because the, practicing nurse was racist. There's just no nice way to say it. Really hesitating between vaccinating my daughter, and it was such a racist trope that I'm used to, where it
Oh,
was like,
no.
if you don't, yeah. So, so anyway, she got her first vaccine, but I have to find an Indigenous program to try to get her second one, because just calling 811 is not going to work for Indigenous people, and it didn't work for us. And I wish I wouldn't have done it. In retrospect, again, every interaction I have with Alberta Health ends up like that, so it's just awful. Anyway, so I got to get her second one, and my husband, really lucky, he can basically get his second anytime he wants to. But like most people, just kind of hesitating because he can, because he has that privilege.
Yeah. Well, hopefully you can kind of drive him up to just like we're going for dinner, and then just shove him into a vaccine clinic.
Yeah, well, he apparently made an appointment, so at least that's progress. But I don't know when it is, so I can't make sure we're successful in getting him there.
It's like a get out the vote, Michelle. Like,
right?
You gotta get everybody. Yeah, totally. Everything comes back to politics.
It really does. I tell people, even the paint on the wall is political anyway. I could go on all day, and I really appreciate you coming on my show. And I want you to know, one, you're welcome back anytime. And two, we need to continue this conversation, because we can go in so many different directions. And I know that there is like you were talking a bit about Angela and, Indigenous perspective, like there is, because media is so racist and so white supremacist, my podcast is really successful, literally because it's centered around, in today's episode, 2 women of color in Canada. And there is a need for it, because otherwise people wouldn't be downloading my podcast, which surprises me, by the way, every day that I have a single listener, let alone multiple. So
congratulations. And I mean, I think voices like yours and Angela's, like, they're so important. And I will give a plug also to the article that you told me to read, Michelle, by Fatima Syed in, Chatelaine, where she talked about being a Muslim and like dealing with, I guess, or coming to terms with how we should feel about Indigenous issues. And it's a really powerful, good article that if people are not, if people who are Muslim who are listening to this, I highly suggest you read it, because it's just beautiful to see how, I don't know, like they're, how we can support each other as communities.
Yeah, 100%. And ultimately, like, that's just it. Like, we are united in fighting racism and white supremacy. So the sooner that we can all get on board and help each other, the better. And so obviously in my community, making sure that we kind of debunk any of this anti-Muslim belief system. And by the way, I was kind of giggling when you were talking about the Sikhs getting attacked for two reasons, because it just amplifies how incredibly ignorant the average Joe Canadian is. But two, the irony being the whole purpose of the turban is to be like, if you're in trouble, look around and find a turban to help you. And the irony is, of course, we use it as a weapon against the community because we're idiots.
It's so sad. I mean, it's just, and like, I feel like we can't even end this without talking about Bill 21 in Quebec and like how, I mean, that is systemic racism and that is legislated racism, right? Like people who wear turbans or people who wear hijabs or, people of the Jewish faith who wear, I think it's called the kippah at the back of, on their heads. Like you can't be a lawyer, you can't be a teacher because you want to practice your faith. Like that's not okay, right? So yeah, I mean, I know that people across Canada are upset about that, but like we need to get that law repealed.
Well, I'm literally talking to you about TRC 57. Like that's literally anti TR 57.
Yeah.
Like, how can we even talk about anti-racism training for public servants when our elected public servants are like instituting racist legislation? Like, I can't even wrap my head around how in the wrong direction it is. Like, it's just completely 180 from each other. So I'm 100% with you that it needs to be repealed. I just can't believe we're even in this situation and we're having this conversation. I can't even believe it.
No, I mean, either. I mean, I can't believe that, this has been in place. I feel like it's been almost a year, maybe more.
Mm-hmm.
And, and there's an entire province where this is okay. And it's so sad. Like, it's really sad.
It's so gross. It makes me sick to my stomach. It really does. So anyway, I really appreciate you being on my show. I'm going to do this ridiculous exit of resources for all of our listeners. And I just really encourage you to chime in at any point in time. And I wanted to make a quick point too that Esmahan talked about how, white passing she is, except for her name. And when I started off my podcast, I go out of my way to say as a Michelle Robinson or as a Michelle Elliott in an English colonial world, how that has afforded me privilege. And this is such a great example to point that out because your name is Esmahan, that people are like, sorry, say that again. Can you say that one more time? Okay. So Esmahan. Okay. And that is the point of having a name like Michelle Elliott, Michelle Robinson, getting a job, getting a loan, getting anything, right? So I just wanted to point that out too. I'm really proud that this podcast has given solutions and included cultural safety training or cultural first aid in almost every one of them to create a safer place for Indigenous people of color, those with disabilities, and LGBTQ2+ to speak. I want to say thank you to authors Cheryl Ward, Chelsea Branch, and Alicia Fridkin of heretohelp.bc.ca of Indigenous people, what is cultural safety and why I should care about it. Their work on those cultural action tools, I've said hundreds of times in my podcast, so please support Indigenous work as part of your reconciliation work and settler understanding. I'm just lucky enough to highlight and repeat it here. Internalized racism or lateral violence is another form of violence that marginalized folks are experiencing under the structure of racism. Racialequitytools.org, What is Internalized Racism by Donna Bevins is a good resource. Do's and Don'ts for Bystander Intervention by American Friends and Family. So they have a whole link about that I've spoken about. If you see or experience racism in Alberta, report it to Act to End Racism and text at 587-506-3838. This is why I need my glasses. Indigenous people have been talking about our issues, sharing our traumas in reports, commissions, and public hearings, just so it can be regularly disregarded. No more. Honor our words, honor the treaties. Listen to politicians and their platforms and policies. If they don't understand marginalized in their budget with Gender Equity Plus, if they're cutting violence prevention programs and services, Indigenous education, uterus health choices, gay straight alliances, lack of human rights for migrants, immigrants, folks with disabilities, know that your vote to that party directly negatively impacts marginalized people. Demand that they implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, the recommendations of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the multiple reports about child welfare reform, the violence prevention programs, and now 231 calls to justice from the National Inquiry on Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit. Denying those reports is a form of abuse called gaslighting. Our people are experiencing extreme racism in the educational, justice, and health institutions, with multiple reports that say the same thing. Demand change from election platforms and politicians. If they don't understand colonialism, racism, privilege, and sexism, they literally have zero business running. This should be understood by all parties, local politicians, community organizations, sports clubs, etc. A really great article I said out loud is Truth Before Truth, How Non-Indigenous Canadians Become Allies. If you're experiencing emotional distress after hearing anything we talk about today and want to talk, you can call the First Nation and Inuit Hope for Wellness helpline at 855-242-3310. It's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they also have a text option at hopeforwellness.ca. If related to more missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit, you can call 844-413-6649. And for non-Indigenous, there are distress center lines in your area, you sometimes functioning 211s. And there's a toll-free line that you can get here in Canada, 833-456-4566. 60 Scoop Indigenous Society of Alberta is ssisa.ca. And you can also look up #SurvivorDriven. So, and again, if you experience racism here in Alberta, and act to end racism at 587-506-3838. I also want to give a shout out to the Trevor Project. They have tons of different supports for LGBTQ2+. They have a youth line, a peer support line, kids help phone at 1-800-668-6868. And you can also go to lifevoices.ca for more LGBTQ2+ supports. Violence is my everyday reality. Every Indigenous generation has faced it. That's why I started this podcast, to speak freely without interruption, without tone policing, without leadership shaming, without gaslighting questions, as many people don't want to hear Indigenous opinions, but sure want to tell theirs, usually by people who know nothing about Indigenous, colonialism, the constant surveillance of Indigenous people, our protests, our vigils, and our rights, microaggressions, people dealing with internalized racism, who become gatekeepers and live off the status quo, or other people who are so in their trauma, they stop people from doing the work and deplete personal resources. Internal and external racism is an everyday reality for Indigenous people. That is why I started this podcast, because white supremacist mainstream media is not an alternative for me. I want to say thank you to my ancestors, my granny, my mom, and what strength looks like through your example. I want to thank my dad for teaching me to be strong and blunt, my stepmom for showing me what a proud culture is through her Austrian family and roots, and stepping up and teaching me to be a proud Calgarian. It is through her I am a second generation proud Calgarian. Thank you to my husband Darcy for producing and editing this show. On top of being my husband, my childhood friend, he's the father of our child, and my support during down my journey of the Red Road. He's witnessed decades of racism and sexism. And to our child, who we are blessed to learn from daily, we are honored you chose us. You give me daily accountability to be a stronger and better person. I hope my daughter and my family will be proud in the future of us trying to discuss these present day issues. My Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you to my previous donors for showing your support. If you value listening or watching and can afford to give, thank you. To those who cannot afford to give, I'd love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com, where you can send in your comments or your questions. I also have a YouTube channel where you can go and subscribe. Go to nativecalgarian.com for the latest podcast and pin posts on social media. And I want to end by giving side-eye to those Calgary rabbits. You're lucky I'm not Tradish. And my beautiful cousin would respond, or you'd be in my dish. Thanks for listening.